For my entire childhood, my family called me the ugly one. My sister was the pretty one. My brother was the smart one. And I was the family disappointment. I am Charmaine. I am 29 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful private equity firm owner, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale family reunion at the Oak Creek Country Club in Atlanta to catch up. Between mimosas and caviar, my Aunt Vivian leaned forward smirking and introduced me to a wealthy stranger. "This is the one we do not talk about," Vivian laughed. I looked at my aunt, then looked at the stranger. The stranger pulled out a business card. "Actually, I am here because of her," she said. "She is my boss. She just bought this entire country club." My family froze. I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night, I logged in, disabled every family credit account, and watched their empire burn. But to understand how we got to that explosive moment, you have to understand the nightmare of that afternoon. The Oak Creek Country Club was the crown jewel of the Atlanta elite. It was a sprawling estate with manicured green lawns, towering oak trees, and an atmosphere thick with old money and new arrogance. My parents, Vernon and Brenda, had spent their entire lives clawing their way to the top of the social ladder. They built a lucrative logistics company from the ground up, and they wore their wealth like a weapon. Every Sunday brunch, every holiday gathering, and every family reunion was a calculated performance designed to show the world how perfect they were. I was the one unscripted flaw in their masterpiece. I arrived at the reunion wearing a simple but perfectly tailored emerald green dress. I did not drive my luxury sports car. I took a rideshare instead, wanting to maintain a low profile. The moment I walked onto the outdoor terrace, the oppressive humidity of the Georgia summer hit me, but it was nothing compared to the chilling reception from my own blood. My mother, Brenda, was holding court near the extravagant ice sculpture. She wore a pristine white designer suit dripping with diamonds bought with company money. Next to her was my older sister, Vanessa. Vanessa was 32, and she had always been paraded around as the ultimate prize. She was stunningly beautiful, obsessed with shopping, and completely devoid of any real ambition outside of maintaining her wealthy image. Standing beside Vanessa was her husband, Harrison. Harrison was a 35-year-old white corporate lawyer who came from a privileged background. He loved to insert himself into our African-American family dynamics with a smug sense of superiority. He constantly delivered subtle, passive-aggressive insults masking his racism behind a veneer of sophisticated corporate jargon. He thought he was untouchable because my father Vernon worshipped the ground he walked on. Vernon believed having a ruthless white corporate lawyer in the family elevated their status in the elite business world. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water and stood quietly near the edge of the terrace, watching them laugh and boast. I had spent years enduring this exact dynamic. Growing up, my parents made sure I knew my place. While Vanessa received expensive pageant dresses and private coaching, I was handed her discarded clothes and told to be grateful. When my brother Isaiah brought home mediocre grades, my parents hired private tutors and bought him a new car to encourage him because he was the smart one destined to inherit the family empire. When I earned a full academic scholarship, my mother simply asked why I could not put that much effort into my physical appearance. They thought I was still that broken, insecure girl. They thought I was still living in a cheap apartment working as a low-level data entry clerk. They had absolutely no idea that after I dropped out of my initial college program, I had been quietly recruited into federal financial forensics. They did not know that I had eventually transitioned into the private sector and built a massive private equity firm specializing in hostile takeovers of corrupt corporations. To them, I was just plain boring Charmaine, the ugly duckling, who would never amount to anything. The clinking of crystal glasses drew my attention back to the center of the terrace. My Aunt Vivian was making her rounds. Vivian was my mother's sister, and she shared the same toxic obsession with social hierarchy. She was walking arm in arm with a woman I recognized instantly. It was Evelyn Dubois. Evelyn was a legendary figure in the Southern Financial District. She was a poised, brilliant older woman, known for her ruthless business acumen and impeccable grace. What my family did not know was that Evelyn was also my senior executive vice president. She managed the daily operations of my firm, while I operated quietly from the shadows. Vivian spotted me standing alone near the floral arrangements. A cruel smile spread across her heavily powdered face. She guided Evelyn directly toward me, clearly intending to use me as a prop to demonstrate her own superiority. She wanted to show this wealthy, influential woman that our family had high standards and that I was merely the unfortunate exception. Vivian placed a manicured hand on Evelyn's arm and pointed at me. "Evelyn, darling." Vivian cooed, her voice loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "I must apologize for the lack of aesthetic in this corner. This is my niece Charmaine. She is the one we do not talk about. The ugly duckling of the family, I am afraid. She just does data entry somewhere in the city. We try to include her out of pity, but she really lacks the family drive." The conversations around us paused. Guests turned their heads, eager to witness the casual humiliation. My mother Brenda stopped talking to her friends and turned to watch, a satisfied smirk playing on her lips. Vanessa giggled behind her champagne glass, leaning into Harrison, who shook his head in mock pity. They were all waiting for me to lower my eyes, to blush, to shrink away into the background, just as I had done 1,000 times before. I did not shrink. I stood perfectly still, keeping my posture relaxed and my gaze fixed on Evelyn. Evelyn stopped walking. The polite smile vanished from her face, replaced by a mask of absolute cold authority. She looked at Vivian, removing her arm from my aunt's grasp with a slow, deliberate motion that radiated pure disdain. Evelyn reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a heavy embossed business card. She held it up so the afternoon sun caught the gold lettering. Vivian looked at the card in confusion. "Actually," Evelyn said, her voice ringing out across the quiet terrace with crystal clarity, "I am here today specifically because of her." Vivian let out a nervous little laugh, fluttering her eyelashes. "Oh, Evelyn, you are too kind, trying to make the poor girl feel better." "I am not being kind," Evelyn replied, staring directly into Vivian's eyes. "I am stating a financial fact. Charmaine is not a data entry clerk. She is my boss. She is the founder and majority shareholder of Vanguard Equity. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, she is the sole owner of the holding company that just purchased this entire country club. You are currently standing on her property." The silence that fell over the terrace was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet that sucked all the air out of the humid summer afternoon. The wine glass in Vanessa's hand trembled, spilling a few drops of expensive champagne onto the pristine stone patio. My Aunt Vivian stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, unable to process the words she had just heard. My mother Brenda reacted first, operating on pure panicked instinct. She shoved her way through the crowd of stunned guests, her white suit contrasting sharply with her rapidly reddening face. She marched directly up to me and grabbed my upper arm, her fingernails digging painfully into my skin. She let out a loud, high-pitched laugh that sounded more like a shriek. "Evelyn, please do not listen to her," Brenda announced, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "Charmaine has always been a bitter liar. She has these psychological delusions. Ever since she was a teenager wearing her sister's hand-me-downs, she has been deeply envious of our success. She is probably paying you to go along with this pathetic prank just to ruin our family reunion." I looked down at my mother's hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I simply stared at her fingers until the sheer coldness of my expression forced her to slowly release her grip. "I am not paying her to say anything, Mother," I said, my voice completely level and devoid of any emotion. "I own the firm. I bought the club. And I would appreciate it if you did not touch me again." Before Brenda could formulate another desperate lie, Harrison stepped forward. He pushed his way past my mother, puffing out his chest and using his physical presence to try and intimidate me. He wore a custom-tailored suit and an expression of pure, arrogant entitlement. He looked at me with absolute disgust, his blue eyes narrowing as he prepared to deliver his barrage of subtle racist microaggressions. "Listen here," Charmaine, Harrison sneered, keeping his voice just low enough to sound professional, but loud enough to carry. "We all know you are dealing with some severe inadequacy issues. You could not even finish your public college degree. You do not belong in this world of high finance, and you certainly do not have the intellectual capacity to run a private equity firm. You are a low-level clerk who probably hacked a corporate website to print some fake business cards. Stop trying to drag your successful family down to your ghetto level. Go back to your cheap apartment before I have club security physically remove you for trespassing. I looked at Harrison, letting his vitriol wash over me without reacting. He was so confident in his white privilege, so sure that his position as a corporate lawyer made him a god among men. He truly believed he could speak to me like trash and face zero consequences because my father Vernon had always enabled his behavior. I reached into my small clutch purse and pulled out my phone. I did not yell. I did not defend myself. I did not try to explain the intricate details of my financial empire to a man whose ego was entirely dependent on my subjugation. I simply opened a secure banking application connected directly to the Federal Reserve networks I legally operated within. "Are you calling for a cab?" Harrison mocked, letting out a harsh laugh. "Make sure it is an economy ride. We would not want you to overdraw your checking account." I typed a single authorization code into my phone, then I pressed send. I looked up at Harrison and offered him a chilling, lifeless smile. "I am not calling a cab, Harrison. I am just managing my portfolio. You see, when I run a full forensic audit on my new acquisitions, I tend to find a lot of interesting irregularities." Harrison frowned, confused by my calm demeanor. He opened his mouth to deliver another insult, but he was interrupted by the sharp ringing of his own cell phone. He ignored it, trying to maintain his dominant posture over me. The phone rang again, louder this time. "You might want to answer that," I suggested softly. Harrison sneered, but pulled the phone from his pocket. He glanced at the screen, and his annoyance quickly shifted to profound confusion. It was an automated alert from his elite platinum banking service. He tapped the screen to open the message, and I watched the blood rapidly drain from his arrogant face, leaving him looking like a ghost in the bright afternoon sun. He stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing silently. His hands began to shake so violently he nearly dropped the expensive device onto the stone patio. "What is it, babe?" Vanessa asked, stepping up beside him and grabbing his arm. "Who is texting you?" Harrison could not answer. He was completely paralyzed. Evelyn Dubois stepped forward, her tone dripping with professional elegance. "Would you like me to explain it to them, Charmaine, or would you prefer the honor?" I kept my eyes locked on my brother-in-law, watching his entire world crumble in real time. "I will handle it, Evelyn," I said quietly. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Harrison, forcing him to step back. I lowered my voice so only he and my immediate family could hear the absolute destruction I was about to unleash. "That text message is from your bank." "Harrison," I explained, my words slicing through the humid air like a razor blade. "It is an automatic notification informing you that your corporate credit card, the one you just used to open a massive tab at the club bar, has been permanently declined. It also states that every single asset attached to your social security number has been frozen pending a federal investigation." My mother let out a strangled gasp, clutching the lapels of her white suit. Vernon, who had been watching from the sidelines, pushed his way to the front, his heavy brow furrowed in deep anger. "What is the meaning of this nonsense?" Vernon roared, pointing a thick finger at me. "You are playing dangerous games, Charmaine. Fix whatever cyber trick you just pulled on my son-in-law right now." I turned my cold gaze to my father. "It is not a trick, Vernon. It is a targeted financial lockdown. When my firm bought this country club, I acquired all of its financial records. I noticed that Harrison has been running a massive tab here for the past 2 years, but he has not been paying for it with his own money. He has been using a series of dummy shell companies to embezzle hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from your logistics empire retirement accounts to fund his and Vanessa's luxury lifestyle." Vanessa shrieked, dropping her champagne glass completely. The crystal shattered into a dozen pieces against the stone. She grabbed Harrison's jacket, crying hysterically and asking him if it was true. Harrison was hyperventilating, his chest heaving, as he realized I had just exposed his massive criminal fraud in front of the entire Atlanta elite. You called me the ugly one, I said, my voice echoing across the silent terrace. You called me a failure and a disappointment. You thought you could abuse me and mock me for my entire life and I would just swallow it. But true power does not announce itself with loud insults or stolen designer clothes. True power operates in the quiet. I turned my back on my stunned, trembling family and looked at Evelyn. We are leaving now, Evelyn. Cancel the remaining event reservations and have security escort any non-paying guests off my property. I walked away from the terrace, leaving my family drowning in the realization that the daughter they threw away was the one holding the match to their paper empire. The oppressive humidity of the Georgia summer afternoon hung heavy over the stone terrace. But the sudden silence among the country club elite was far more suffocating. Everyone was staring at Harrison. He stood frozen next to the elaborate ice sculpture, staring down at his phone, as if the device had suddenly caught fire. The automatic notification from his elite platinum banking service glared brightly on his screen. I knew exactly what the message said because I was the one who had authorized the permanent freeze on his accounts just moments before. I watched the arrogant smirk melt completely off his face. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his pale skin looking sickly under the bright sun. For years, this man had walked into my African-American family and paraded his white privilege and corporate title like a crown. He had delivered countless subtle racist insults and condescending remarks about my simple lifestyle, always masking his venom behind sophisticated corporate jargon. He truly believed he was untouchable. He truly believed my father Vernon would always protect him. But right now, standing in the middle of the country club, my private equity firm had just purchased, Harrison was entirely powerless. The silence stretched on for several agonizing seconds. The bartender standing behind the outdoor bar cleared his throat awkwardly, holding up Harrison's rejected credit card. The magnetic strip had failed, the chip had failed, the override codes had failed. Harrison finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. His survival instincts kicked in, and he immediately went into damage control mode. He let out a loud, forced laugh that echoed harshly across the quiet patio. He quickly snatched his phone and shoved it deep into his tailored suit pocket. He turned to the bartender and waved his hand dismissively. He announced in a booming voice that his bank must have placed a fraud alert on his accounts because he traveled internationally so frequently for his high-profile investment firm. He puffed out his chest and told the surrounding guests that these overly protective security measures were simply the price one had to pay when managing such massive wealth. It was a pathetic, desperate lie, but my family eagerly swallowed it whole. My mother Brenda let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief and smoothed the fabric of her pristine white designer suit. She nodded vigorously, agreeing with Harrison and telling her wealthy friends that dealing with elite banks was always such a hassle. My father Vernon immediately stepped forward, clapping Harrison firmly on the back. Vernon smiled proudly and praised his son-in-law for being so successful that the federal banking system had to keep a close eye on his millions. They were so desperate to maintain their perfect social image that they blindly accepted his ridiculous excuse without a single question. I just stood there near the floral arrangements, keeping my hands relaxed by my sides. I watched them build a fortress of denial around the golden boy. Then Vernon turned his attention to me. The proud, supportive smile he had just given Harrison vanished instantly. His face contorted into the familiar mask of rage and profound disappointment he had always reserved exclusively for me. He marched across the terrace, closing the physical distance between us, until he was looming over me. His thick, heavy brow furrowed as he pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. He demanded to know what kind of sick psychological game I was playing. He yelled that I had intentionally caused a scene to humiliate our family in front of Evelyn Dubois and the rest of the Atlanta Society guests. His voice vibrated with genuine fury as he reminded me of how much money he had spent organizing this lavish family reunion just for me to show up in a cheap dress and spew delusional lies about owning private equity firms. He demanded that I apologize to Harrison immediately for disrespecting him in public. He told me that I was a bitter, jealous failure who could not stand to see other people succeed. I looked into my father's angry eyes. This was the man who had built a $50 million logistics empire from nothing. He was a ruthless, brilliant businessman in the corporate world. But when it came to his own family, he was completely blind. He demanded absolute loyalty and submission from his children, and he punished anyone who dared to step outside the narrow boxes he had created for us. I was the ugly one, the disappointment, the child who refused to play the corporate game his way. And because I did not fit his aesthetic, he treated me like a disease. I looked at the man demanding an apology, and I felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no sadness, just a cold, clinical clarity. Sensing the shift in the atmosphere, my sister Vanessa rushed forward to join the attack. Vanessa had always been the pretty one, the child who eagerly wore the expensive clothes and smiled for the cameras. She linked her arm tightly through Harrison's, seeking to protect her perfect husband from my supposed toxicity. She glared at me with pure, unadulterated venom. She started dissecting my appearance right there on the terrace. She loudly mocked my simple emerald green dress and my complete lack of expensive jewelry. She turned to the guests who were still watching our family drama unfold and announced that I was just a lonely, miserable woman. She claimed that I had always been deeply envious of the fact that she was happily married to a successful white man who could give her the world. She accused me of projecting my pathetic financial struggles onto her flawless life. She sneered and told everyone that while she spent her summers touring Europe and dining at exclusive resorts, I was scraping by in a cramped apartment doing meaningless data entry work. She told me that my attempt to sabotage her perfect marriage out of pure jealousy was the most disgusting thing she had ever witnessed. I let her talk. I let her hurl every insult and accusation she had been storing up for years. I stood perfectly still and let her dig her own grave while her husband sweated profusely beside her. Harrison was trying to maintain a confident smirk, but a single drop of sweat rolled down his pale temple. He knew the truth. He knew his accounts held exactly $0. He knew his entire life was currently balancing on the edge of a cliff, and I was the one holding the rope. I waited for Vanessa to run out of breath. The terrace fell silent once again as everyone waited for my reaction. They expected me to cry or scream or run away in shame, just as I had done when I was a vulnerable teenager. Instead, I looked directly into Harrison's panicked blue eyes. I kept my voice completely level, soft, and dangerous. I asked him a very simple question. I asked him why a top-tier investment broker handling multi-million-dollar portfolios for the elite class had a premium corporate credit card declining for a simple $300 bar tab. The words hung in the humid air like a physical threat. Harrison physically recoiled, taking a stumbling step backward as if I had struck him across the face. His jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. He frantically tried to formulate a coherent sentence about liquidity and temporary offshore transfer holds, but his brain was short-circuiting. The smooth corporate jargon he always used to intimidate me completely failed him. He looked at me with genuine terror, finally realizing that I was not a delusional data clerk. I was the architect of his destruction. Before Harrison could completely collapse under the weight of my question, my brother Isaiah stepped aggressively into the circle. Isaiah was the smart one, the golden boy who was destined to inherit my father's throne. He wore a custom-tailored designer suit and an expression of supreme, insufferable arrogance. He positioned himself physically between me and Harrison, blocking my line of sight. Isaiah let out a loud, mocking laugh and told the entire family to just ignore my rampant financial illiteracy. He waved his hand at me as if I were a minor annoyance. He proudly brought up his new tech startup, bragging that he had just secured another massive round of venture capital funding. Isaiah looked down his nose at me and reminded everyone present that I was nothing but a public college dropout. He stated that I simply did not have the intellectual capacity to understand complex financial instruments, unlike his brilliant Ivy League-educated mind. He told me that high finance was a man's game and that I was embarrassing myself by trying to use vocabulary I clearly did not comprehend. He instructed me to go back to my cheap apartment and leave the real business to the men of the family. He actually reached out and patted my shoulder in a sickeningly condescending gesture meant to put me back in my place. I looked at the three men standing united against me. Vernon with his blind, demanding pride, Harrison with his crumbling fake facade, and Isaiah with his stolen, unearned arrogance. I looked at my mother and sister, who were actively defending and shielding the very men who were secretly destroying their legacy. I realized in that profound moment that I had gathered all the behavioral data I needed for the day. There was no point in arguing with people who were committed to their own delusions. I did not raise my voice. I did not beg them to believe the truth. I did not try to explain that I was a senior federal financial investigator who had transitioned into private equity. I simply took a slow step back. I looked at my father and told him to enjoy the rest of his afternoon on my property. I turned away from my family and began walking across the terrace. I walked through the heavy glass doors and into the grand lobby of the country club. My heels clicked steadily and rhythmically against the polished marble floors. I could feel the collective stare of my family and their wealthy friends burning into my back, but I did not turn around. I kept my head held high and walked out the main entrance, stepping back into the sweltering Georgia heat. I left their toxic echo chamber behind, feeling a deep and resonant sense of peace. The expansive parking lot was mostly empty as I made my way toward the designated rideshare area. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly, but my mind was icy and entirely focused. As I approached the pickup zone, I saw a sleek black luxury town car idling quietly in the shade of a massive oak tree. Standing next to the vehicle waiting patiently was Evelyn Dubois. She was no longer playing the part of the polite society guest mingling at a brunch. She was back in her true form as my senior executive vice president. She stood with perfect posture, projecting absolute competence and lethal efficiency. Evelyn held out a thick, classified financial dossier as I approached the car. I reached out and took the heavy folder from her hands, feeling the weight of the secrets hidden inside. Evelyn looked at me with a grim professional expression. She told me that her forensic accounting team had completed their deep dive into Harrison's brokerage firm while I was distracting the family on the terrace. She said the firewall had been breached and the internal ledgers were fully exposed. I opened the thick folder right there in the parking lot, ignoring the oppressive heat. My eyes scanned the highlighted documents, the bank routing numbers, and the hidden transfer logs. The truth printed on those pages revealed a reality far darker and more destructive than a simple declined credit card. Harrison's prestigious investment firm was not just failing, it was a complete and utter mirage. He was not a successful broker, he was a desperate criminal. The documents proved that he had been systematically and secretly embezzling millions of dollars directly from my father Vernon's corporate retirement accounts. Every luxury vacation Vanessa took, every designer dress she wore, every expensive country club fee, and every flashy car they leased was being paid for by my father's stolen life savings. Harrison was bleeding the family empire dry to fund his own pathetic illusions of grandeur. I turned to the final page of the dossier and felt my heart rate slow to a calm, calculating rhythm. The final document was a pending wire transfer request. Harrison was preparing to drain the final remaining retirement account by the end of the week. He was going to take the last of the money and leave my parents completely destitute. I closed the folder and looked back toward the country club, where my family was currently laughing and celebrating the man who was actively destroying them. They had called me the ugly one my entire life. They were about to find out just how ugly the truth could be. 2 days passed since the country club incident. The silence from my family was deafening, but I knew it was only the calm before the storm. I had retreated to my modest apartment in the quiet outskirts of Atlanta. It was a space I kept intentionally simple, devoid of the lavish excess my parents worshipped. The plain white walls and basic furniture were a constant reminder of where I started and how far I had come on my own. I was sitting at my kitchen island reviewing the devastating financial forensics report on Harrison's embezzlement, when a loud, aggressive pounding on my front door shattered the morning peace. I did not need to look through the peephole to know who it was. The heavy, entitled knocking carried the unmistakable signature of my father Vernon. I opened the door to find Vernon and my mother Brenda standing in the dimly lit hallway. They looked completely out of place in my building. Vernon was wearing a custom-tailored navy suit that likely cost more than my entire year's rent, while Brenda clutched a limited-edition designer handbag against her chest, as if she feared the very air in my hallway might contaminate it. Neither of them offered a greeting. They simply pushed past me, barging into my sanctuary with the same arrogant entitlement they brought to every aspect of their lives. Vernon immediately began pacing the length of my small living room. His heavy footsteps echoed off the hardwood floor as he inspected my simple decor with a look of profound disgust. Brenda took a gingerly seat on the edge of my sofa, refusing to lean back against the cushions. She looked around my apartment and let out a dramatic, disappointed sigh. They had just witnessed me expose their golden son-in-law as a criminal fraud 2 days ago, yet they walked into my home acting as if they were still the monarchs of the universe, and I was still their disobedient peasant daughter. Vernon stopped his pacing and turned to face me, his heavy brow furrowed in anger. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not apologize for the horrific things they had said to me at the country club. He got straight to the point. He demanded that I go to the bank immediately and take out a massive personal loan leveraging the assets of my private equity firm. He stated it as a command, not a request. He claimed that my brother Isaiah was facing a minor cash flow issue with his tech startup. According to Vernon, it was just a temporary bottleneck, and Isaiah needed exactly $3 million by the end of the week to secure a massive international contract that would double the family wealth. I stood my ground, crossing my arms over my chest and staring at the man who had always treated me like an unwanted burden. I asked him why a brilliant Ivy League-educated tech founder like Isaiah needed to borrow money from the ugly college dropout sister he despised. Vernon lost his temper instantly. He took a threatening step toward me, his face flushing dark red. He insisted that since I chose to live so cheaply in this pathetic apartment, I clearly did not need the millions of dollars I supposedly had. He told me it was my fundamental duty to support the son who actually had a real future. He declared that Isaiah was the true visionary of the family, the one destined to carry the family legacy into the next generation, and that my only purpose was to serve as a stepping stone for his success. When I calmly refused and told them I would not give Isaiah a single dime, Brenda immediately shifted tactics. She realized Vernon's physical intimidation was not working, so she resorted to her favorite weapon, which was psychological manipulation. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, manufactured suffering, and she began to cry those fake, calculated tears I had seen 1,000 times before. She weaponized my own childhood trauma against me. She brought up the severe asthma I had suffered from as a little girl. She recounted the expensive inhalers, the emergency hospital visits, and the late nights she supposedly spent sitting awake, worrying about my breathing. Brenda leaned forward on the sofa, her eyes narrowing with malicious intent. She told me that I had been a massive financial burden on the family since the day I was born. She claimed that all the money they spent keeping me alive and breathing was the exact reason they could not give Vanessa and Isaiah more advantages early in life. She rewrote our entire family history right there in my living room, painting herself as a martyr and me as a selfish parasite. She said it was finally time for me to repay my profound debts to the family that kept me alive. She told me I owed Isaiah that money for all the attention and resources I had stolen from him when we were children. I looked at my mother and felt a wave of absolute revulsion wash over me. The sheer audacity of trying to guilt-trip me over childhood medical bills was staggering. I kept my voice dangerously soft and entirely devoid of emotion. I told my mother that paying for basic medical care was the fundamental legal and moral obligation of a parent, not a predatory loan to be collected with interest 30 years later. I told her that if she truly believed keeping her daughter breathing was a financial burden, then she was an even worse mother than I had originally thought. My words struck a nerve. Vernon slammed his heavy hand down on my small dining table, making my coffee mug rattle loudly against the wood. He towered over me, roaring that I was an ungrateful, wretched child who had forgotten her place. He threatened to call his high-priced corporate lawyers that very afternoon and have me legally disowned. He told me he would erase my name from the family records, strip me of any future inheritance, and make sure I was dead to the entire Atlanta business elite. He promised to destroy my reputation and ruin my private equity firm if I did not immediately transfer the funds to Isaiah's account. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I simply walked away from his towering rage and moved toward my kitchen counter. I picked up my tablet, which was still displaying the highly classified federal documents Evelyn had forwarded to me earlier that morning. I turned around and walked slowly back to where Vernon was standing. I held the tablet out so the glowing screen illuminated his angry face. I told him that legal disownment was the absolute least of his worries right now. I looked directly into my father's eyes and shattered his entire reality. I explained that Isaiah did not have a minor cash flow issue. I told them the truth that Isaiah's groundbreaking tech startup was nothing but a massive, elaborate crypto Ponzi scheme. My brilliant Ivy League brother had spent the last 2 years defrauding hundreds of international investors out of millions of dollars using fake algorithms and dummy accounts to wash the money. Vernon stared at the screen, his mouth falling open as he read the official federal seal stamped at the top of the digital document. Brenda stopped her fake crying and stood up, her hands trembling as she tried to comprehend what I was saying. I tapped the screen, highlighting a specific paragraph for them to read. I explained that federal regulators were not just investigating Isaiah for financial discrepancies. They had already frozen his domestic accounts and issued a secret warrant for his arrest on charges of massive wire fraud and international money laundering. I watched the absolute terror dawn in my parents' eyes as they finally realized the magnitude of the situation. I lowered the tablet and delivered the final crushing blow. I told them that Isaiah did not need my $3 million to secure an international contract. He needed the money to buy a fake passport and pay off a smuggling ring so he could flee the country before the federal agents kicked his front door down. I smiled coldly and asked Vernon if he really wanted me to wire money to a federal fugitive. The silence in my small apartment was absolute. Vernon stood frozen, his hand hovering over the table while Brenda sank back onto the sofa completely speechless. They did not apologize. They did not ask how to save Isaiah legally. They simply turned and walked out of my front door, their desperate illusions shattered by the weight of federal warrants. You would think that realizing one golden child was a criminal fugitive and the other was married to an embezzler would humble them. But toxic families do not seek redemption, they seek retaliation. They need a scapegoat to carry the weight of their own failures, and for my entire life, that scapegoat had been me. 2 weeks passed without a single word from my parents or my siblings. I spent those 14 days quietly dismantling the rest of their financial infrastructure from the secure servers in my office. I knew they were panicking behind closed doors, but in public, they were determined to maintain their flawless facade. Vanessa and Harrison decided the best way to reclaim the family narrative was to host the social event of the season. The annual Heritage Charity Gala was a staple for Atlanta's affluent African-American elite. It was a highly publicized night of philanthropy, flowing champagne, and unspoken social warfare. This year, my sister and her husband were the primary sponsors. An invitation arrived at my apartment printed on heavy cream cardstock with gold foil lettering. They wanted me there. Vanessa needed an audience to reestablish her superiority, and Harrison needed to prove to himself that my revelations at the country club were nothing but a fluke. He desperately wanted to believe that I was just a lucky hacker who had stumbled onto a single bank record. He refused to accept that a plain-looking black woman whom he had openly mocked for years could possibly hold his entire corporate existence in the palm of her hand. I decided to attend. I chose a simple floor-length black gown with no jewelry and pulled my hair back into a neat bun. I did not need to dress for their approval anymore. I arrived at the Grand Biltmore Hotel just as the main ballroom doors were opening. The venue was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over dozens of tables draped in white silk. Classical music drifted through the air as the city's wealthiest residents mingled in their custom tuxedos and designer gowns. My parents were already seated at the primary VIP table right next to the stage holding court as if their empire was not currently burning to the ground. I walked up to the host stand to find my seating assignment. The young woman running the guest list looked at my name and gave me a tight, uncomfortable smile. She motioned for a waiter to escort me to my table. I followed the young man past the front row where the major donors sat. We walked past the middle section where the local politicians and business leaders were drinking wine. We kept walking until we reached the very back of the massive ballroom. The waiter stopped and gestured to a small, wobbly table squeezed directly next to the swinging metal doors of the kitchen. It was the ultimate social insult. Every time the kitchen doors opened, the loud clattering of pots and pans spilled out, drowning the music. The waiters rushed past my chair, constantly bumping against my shoulder as they carried heavy trays of food. The guests at the neighboring tables were casting sideways glances at me, whispering behind their hands. They all knew who I was, and they all knew exactly what sitting at this table meant. Vanessa had deliberately placed me in the most humiliating spot in the room to publicly declare that I was the outcast. She wanted the entire elite circle of Atlanta to see that I belonged in the shadows near the service staff while she sparkled in the spotlight. I sat down gracefully and smoothed my napkin over my lap. I did not let a single trace of embarrassment show on my face. I simply watched the room, analyzing the fake smiles and the forced laughter. Vanessa glanced over from the head table, her eyes locking onto mine. A wide, triumphant smirk spread across her perfectly contoured face. She raised her champagne glass slightly in my direction, a silent toast to her own petty cruelty. I nodded slowly in response, knowing that her victory was going to be incredibly short-lived. After the first course was cleared, I excused myself and walked out into the long, dimly lit corridor leading to the restrooms. The hallway was quiet, completely separated from the noise and music of the main ballroom. As I rounded the corner, I saw Harrison waiting for me. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed over his tailored tuxedo jacket. His face was flushed and his eyes were dark with an ugly, simmering rage. He stepped directly into the center of the hallway, physically blocking my path. "You really thought you did something at the country club, didn't you?" He said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You hacked a few banking portals and thought you could play games with the big boys. You think you are so smart, Charmaine, but you are out of your depth." I stopped walking, maintaining a safe distance but keeping my posture completely relaxed. "I am not playing games, Harrison," I replied quietly. "I am simply cleaning up the mess you made." Harrison let out a harsh, mocking laugh, pushing off the wall and taking a step closer to me. He wanted to use his physical size to intimidate me, just as he had always done. "You do not belong in my world of high finance," he sneered, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "You are a pathetic nobody who lives in a cheap apartment. Your father brought me into this family to elevate you people, to give this family some actual corporate legitimacy. You should be on your knees thanking me for the social status I provide. Instead, you are acting like a bitter, jealous girl who cannot stand the fact that her sister married a successful white man who actually knows how to run a business." The sheer magnitude of his delusion was almost fascinating. He was actively embezzling millions of dollars from an African-American family business to cover his own failures. Yet he stood there preaching about how he had elevated us. His racism and classism were so deeply ingrained that he genuinely believed his whiteness and his law degree made him inherently superior to me regardless of the facts. "You do not have any money." "Harrison," I stated calmly, looking directly into his angry eyes. "Your firm is facing insolvency. You are drowning in gambling debts and your corporate accounts are frozen. You are a fraud standing in a rented tuxedo. He lunged forward, grabbing my wrist with a bruising grip. His breath smelled of expensive scotch and pure panic. Listen to me, you ugly little failure, he hissed, his mask of corporate sophistication completely shattering. You are going to go back to that cheap apartment, and you are going to keep your mouth shut. You do not know the people I work with. You do not understand the offshore accounts. If you try to humiliate me again, I will make sure your miserable life is completely destroyed. Do you understand me? I looked down at his hand wrapped tightly around my wrist. Then I looked back up into his eyes. I smiled a slow, cold smile that made him involuntarily loosen his grip. I understand perfectly, Harrison, I whispered. I understand that you are running out of time. I pulled my arm away and walked past him, leaving him standing alone in the quiet corridor. When I returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The lights were dimmed and the spotlight was focused on the center stage. Vanessa was standing behind the crystal podium, gripping the microphone with both hands. She looked breathtaking in a silver-sequined gown, the picture of absolute grace and tragedy. She was in the middle of delivering her keynote speech. Vanessa began by talking about the importance of the charity they were sponsoring tonight, speaking eloquently about giving back to the community and supporting those who were less fortunate. The audience listened with rapt attention, completely captivated by her performance. But then her tone shifted. Her voice began to tremble perfectly on cue. She looked down at her hands and let out a soft, heartbroken sigh. She was shifting the narrative from philanthropy to personal victimization. She looked up at the wealthy crowd, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice breaking delicately over the speakers, "philanthropy is about helping the broken, and sadly, sometimes the most broken people are the ones in our own families." A collective murmur of sympathy rolled through the ballroom. My parents looked on with expressions of solemn support. Harrison, who had just returned to his seat, placed a comforting hand on the small of Vanessa's back. "It is so hard to love someone who is deeply troubled," Vanessa continued, wiping a single tear from her cheek. "It is hard to support a sister who suffers from such profound envy that she tries to tear down the people who love her most. We have tried so hard to help my sister Charmaine. We have given her everything. But her jealousy and her psychological struggles have made her bitter. She tries to sabotage our family out of pure spite because she cannot build a successful life of her own. But despite her darkness, my husband and I refuse to let her toxicity stop us from doing good in this world. We will continue to shine our light even when our own blood tries to drag us into the shadows." The applause that followed was deafening. The elite crowd was moved to tears by her brave confession. They clapped and murmured their support for the beautiful, successful woman who carried the heavy burden of an ugly, jealous sister. Vanessa looked out at the audience, soaking up their adoration. She had successfully painted herself as the ultimate martyr and me as the deranged monster. I did not sit back down at my wobbly table near the kitchen doors. I remained standing at the back of the room. The applause began to die down as Vanessa prepared to introduce the final donation numbers for the evening. I took a deep breath and began walking down the center aisle of the ballroom. The heavy carpet silenced my footsteps, but the guests nearest the aisle noticed me moving. The whispers started immediately spreading through the room like a wave as people realized the troubled sister was approaching the stage. The crowd parted instinctively, giving me a wide berth. I kept my posture straight, my chin up and my eyes locked entirely on Vanessa. Vanessa saw me coming, and her sympathetic smile faltered. She gripped the edges of the podium, her knuckles turning white. She glanced desperately at Harrison, who suddenly looked incredibly pale. My parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats at the front table. They expected me to yell, to throw a tantrum, to prove every single word of Vanessa's speech right by having a public meltdown. I did not yell. I walked calmly up the short flight of stairs and stepped directly onto the brightly lit stage. I stopped right next to Vanessa. She was trembling, practically vibrating with nervous energy. I reached out my hand gently but firmly, taking the microphone from her fingers. She was too shocked to resist. She stepped back, shrinking away from me as I took her place at the podium. I looked out over the sea of wealthy faces. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Hundreds of eyes stared at me, waiting for the crazy sister to humiliate herself. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice steady and perfectly modulated, echoing off the high ceiling. My sister is absolutely right. Philanthropy is about bringing light into the shadows. It is about transparency, honesty, and uplifting the community. Vanessa and Harrison have worked incredibly hard tonight to show you exactly who they are. And I believe it is only fitting that we celebrate their true financial capabilities. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. The guests looked confused but intrigued. Vanessa was staring at me in sheer terror, while Harrison had half risen from his chair, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit. "In honor of my sisters, moving speech, I would like to make a contribution on behalf of my family," I announced, holding the microphone confidently. "Tonight, I am authorizing a $2 million donation to this incredible charity." The ballroom erupted into a massive gasp, followed by wild, spontaneous applause. $2 million was an unprecedented sum for this event. The guests cheered, clapping loudly and looking at me with sudden, intense respect. The troubled sister dropping $2 million in cash instantly shattered the narrative Vanessa had just built. My parents looked completely bewildered, staring at me with their mouths open. I held up my hand, asking for quiet. The applause slowly faded as the audience waited for me to continue. "However, I cannot take the credit for this extraordinary gift," I said, my voice dropping to a serious, grateful tone. I turned my body and pointed directly at Harrison, who was now standing frozen next to the head table. "I want to publicly thank my brother-in-law Harrison for this remarkable contribution." The audience clapped politely, looking at Harrison with admiration. Harrison looked like he was going to vomit. He shook his head slightly, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "You see," I continued, turning back to the audience, "Harrison is a very modest man when it comes to his private wealth. He does not like to talk about the extensive portfolio of offshore accounts he manages. But tonight, transparency is key. The $2 million that was just transferred directly to the charity's escrow account came straight from Harrison's secret personal holding account in the Cayman Islands, an account he has been quietly funding for the past 3 years." The polite applause instantly died, replaced by a tense, stunned silence. The seasoned business leaders and politicians in the room immediately recognized the implication of what I was saying. Secret offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were not used for standard philanthropy. They were used for hiding money from the federal government. Harrison's knees buckled and he fell back heavily into his chair. He stared at me, his blue eyes wide with an absolute soul-crushing horror. He knew that I had not just donated $2 million to charity. I had just legally seized and liquidated his only remaining hidden emergency fund, the money he was planning to use to run away when his embezzlement was fully exposed was gone. I looked down at my parents, who were finally realizing that their white knight son-in-law had been hoarding millions of dollars in untraceable offshore accounts while their own company accounts were bleeding dry. The illusion was dead. The stage was mine, and the destruction of their empire had officially begun. The morning after the charity gala, my phone did not stop ringing. My family was in a state of absolute hysteria. I had publicly humiliated them in front of the entire affluent society of Atlanta, and I had liquidated the secret offshore accounts my brother-in-law Harrison had been using to hide his embezzled funds. But arrogant men like Harrison do not simply accept defeat. When a man whose entire identity is built on white privilege and corporate ruthlessness is backed into a corner, he will always try to use the system to crush the person who exposed him. I knew he would retaliate. I was counting on it. 3 days later, the retaliation arrived at my front door. It was early Tuesday morning, and I was sitting at my kitchen island reviewing the final acquisition portfolios for my private equity firm. The quiet of my modest apartment complex was shattered by the sound of heavy boots marching up the exterior stairwell, followed by a loud, aggressive pounding on my door. I walked over and looked through the peephole. Standing on my welcome mat was Harrison. He was flanked by 2 uniformed county deputies. standing just a few feet behind them on the landing were my parents, Vernon and Brenda. I unlocked the door and pulled it open, keeping my expression completely blank. Harrison looked terrible. His usually perfect blonde hair was disheveled, and there were dark purple bags under his eyes, from 3 sleepless nights of panic. But despite his obvious exhaustion, he wore a smug, triumphant smirk. He was holding a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy ivory paper. He thrust the papers aggressively toward my chest, forcing me to step back. "It is over," Charmaine Harrison sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You thought you were so clever at the gala, but you made one massive miscalculation. You left a digital footprint. My legal team has been working around the clock since Sunday. We just filed a massive civil suit against you in federal court. We are charging you with identity theft, malicious cyber hacking, and corporate espionage." I did not reach for the papers. I simply looked at the 2 deputies who shifted uncomfortably under my gaze. Ma M, one of the deputies, said politely, "We are just here to keep the peace while serving these papers. Mr. Harrison claims you have stolen sensitive financial data and illegally accessed his banking portals." Harrison puffed out his chest, stepping closer to me so the deputies were slightly behind him. He lowered his voice, pitching it so only I could hear the venom dripping from his words. "I told you that you do not belong in my world of high finance, you ugly little failure," he hissed. "You really thought a plain-looking college dropout could outsmart a partner at a top-tier brokerage firm? I have the entire legal system in my pocket. These papers are a cease and desist order and a binding non-disclosure agreement. You are going to sign them right now. You are going to transfer every single cent of that $2 million back into my account, and then you are going to publicly confess that you fabricated the entire story at the gala because you are having a psychotic break. If you refuse, I will have these deputies arrest you for cybercrimes right here, right now." Before I could respond, my father pushed his way to the front of the group. Vernon stood next to Harrison, looking at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. He placed a heavy hand on Harrison's shoulder, completely validating the man who had been secretly stealing his retirement funds. "You should listen to him!" Charmaine Vernon barked, his deep voice echoing in the small breezeway. "This right here is exactly why I brought Harrison into this family. He is a real man. He knows how to handle business, and he knows how to crush a threat. He is the son I always wanted, unlike you. You have always been nothing but a stubborn, ugly stain on our family legacy. You have spent your entire pathetic life being jealous of your sister, and now you have resorted to actual crimes just to ruin her happiness. You are a complete embarrassment to the empire I built. Sign the papers and give Harrison his money back before I let him send you to federal prison." My mother Brenda stood behind Vernon, nodding vigorously. She clutched her designer purse and glared at me. "You have always been a bitter child," Brenda added, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. "You never appreciated anything we did for you. You owe your family this money, Charmaine. You owe us your obedience. Sign the documents and maybe we will let you apologize." I looked at the 4 of them standing on my porch, trying to use fear and intimidation to force me back into the tiny box they had built for me. They were so desperate to believe their own lies. They were so desperate to protect the handsome white corporate lawyer that they were willing to throw their own flesh and blood into a jail cell. They truly believed I was a helpless, terrified girl who had just gotten lucky with a computer trick. I did not sign the papers. I did not raise my voice or defend my character. I simply turned away from the door and walked back into my apartment, leaving it wide open. Harrison let out a loud, arrogant laugh. "Look at her," Vernon Harrison mocked, pointing at my retreating back. "She is running away just like she always does. She knows she is beaten." I walked over to the small console table near my entryway. I picked up a thick manila envelope that had been delivered by a private courier just 20 minutes before they arrived. I walked back to the front door, holding the envelope in my hands. I completely ignored Harrison and my parents. I stepped past them and handed the envelope directly to the lead deputy. "Officer," I said, my voice perfectly calm and respectful, "I highly recommend you read the first page of that certified document before you allow this man to threaten me with arrest on my own property." The deputy looked confused, but he took the envelope and pulled out the crisp legal documents inside. The paper bore the embossed seal of the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission, along with the official letterhead of Vanguard Equity. Harrison frowned, his triumphant smirk faltering slightly as he watched the deputy read. "What is that?" Harrison demanded, taking a step toward the officer. "What fake garbage did she print out now?" The deputy did not answer him immediately. His eyes widened as he scanned the legal text. He looked up from the paper, staring at Harrison with a sudden expression of deep suspicion. Then he looked at me. Is this accurate?" he asked quietly. "It is certified by a federal judge at 8 o'clock this morning," I replied smoothly. Harrison lost his patience and snatched the document directly out of the officer's hands. He stared at the paper, his eyes darting frantically back and forth across the legal jargon. I watched the realization hit him like a freight train. The color drained from his face so quickly, his skin took on a sickly gray hue. His hands began to tremble uncontrollably, making the heavy paper rattle in the quiet morning air. "What does it say?" Vernon demanded, stepping forward and trying to look over Harrison's shoulder. "Harrison, what is happening?" Harrison could not speak. He was completely paralyzed, staring at the document as if it were a death sentence. "Since my brother-in-law seems to have lost his voice, I will explain it to you, Vernon," I said, folding my arms across my chest. "That document is a certified confirmation of a hostile corporate takeover." I stepped closer to Harrison, forcing him to look at me. "You see, Harrison, you were so busy trying to frame me for cybercrimes that you forgot to monitor your own board of directors. When you lost that $2 million offshore safety net, you defaulted on your massive margin loans. Your brokerage firm went into an immediate liquidity crisis yesterday afternoon. Your senior partners were terrified of facing federal prison for your embezzlement scheme." I looked at my parents, watching the horror slowly dawn on their faces. "So, my private equity firm offered them a lifeline," I continued. "I bought out the majority stakeholders of your boutique brokerage firm overnight for pennies on the dollar. They happily sold you out to save themselves. The federal judge signed the transfer of ownership exactly 2 hours ago." Harrison dropped the papers onto the concrete landing. He stumbled backward, gripping the metal railing of the stairwell as if his legs could no longer support his weight. He was gasping for air, his corporate armor completely shattered. I looked down at the documents scattered on the floor, then back up at the man who had tormented me for years. "You do not own an investment firm anymore, Harrison," I whispered, my voice carrying absolute finality. "I own it. Vanguard Equity is the sole proprietor of your entire corporate portfolio. I am legally your boss. And as my very first act as majority shareholder, I am terminating your employment effectively immediately. You are fired." I turned to the deputies who were watching the scene with wide eyes. "Officers," I said, gesturing toward Harrison, "this man is an unemployed trespasser who is currently under federal investigation for defrauding a logistics company. If he does not remove himself from my property within the next 10 seconds, I would like to press charges for harassment." The lead deputy nodded slowly, taking a step toward Harrison and placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Sir," the deputy said, his tone no longer polite or accommodating, "I think it is time for you to leave." Vernon and Brenda stood frozen in shock. The son they had always wanted, the real man they had praised just minutes ago, was being escorted down the stairs by local law enforcement, a broken, sobbing mess. They looked at me, their plain, ugly daughter standing victorious in the doorway of her cheap apartment, realizing too late that I held the keys to their entire kingdom. The days following Harrison's spectacular downfall turned into a brutal reality for my family. With Harrison officially fired from the firm he no longer owned and his offshore accounts completely liquidated, Vanessa's carefully curated world of luxury slammed into an impenetrable brick wall. Her reality shattered overnight. The designer boutiques on the high street suddenly declined her platinum credit cards, leaving her stranded at checkout counters with arms full of clothes she could no longer afford. The prestigious country clubs suspended their membership indefinitely, citing unpaid dues and pending federal investigations. The fallout was swift, merciful, and entirely of their own making. Vernon and Brenda quickly realized that physical intimidation and empty legal threats had failed spectacularly on the porch of my apartment. They were forced to recognize that the ugly daughter they had spent decades dismissing and abusing was now a billionaire holding the very keys to their survival. Their tactics shifted from outright aggression to a sickeningly sweet manipulation meant to trap me in their web of lies once again. 3 days after the standoff at my apartment, I received a handwritten invitation delivered by a private courier. The thick stationery bore the family crest. My parents were requesting my presence at the family mansion for a private reconciliation dinner. The note, written in Brenda's elegant cursive, claimed they wanted to heal the divide, forgive the past, and move forward as a united family. They wanted to put the unpleasantness behind us. I knew it was a desperate trap, but I also knew I needed to see exactly how far they were willing to go to save their sinking ship. I accepted the invitation. I drove my modest sedan up the long, winding, tree-lined driveway of the estate I had grown up in. The massive brick mansion loomed in the fading twilight, standing as a rigid monument to Vernon's ego and Brenda's endless vanity. The heavy oak front doors opened before I even reached the top of the stone steps. Brenda stood there wearing a soft cashmere sweater and a fragile, welcoming smile that did not quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. She reached out, attempting to pull me into a motherly hug, but I kept my distance, stepping smoothly past her into the grand marble foyer. The air inside the house felt thick and suffocating. The formal dining room table was set with the fine vintage family china and crystal wine glasses that were only brought out for wealthy investors or high society guests. Vernon sat at the head of the long mahogany table, pouring an expensive vintage red wine into his glass. Isaiah was seated to his right, wearing a crisp designer shirt and looking remarkably calm for a man who was secretly dodging federal arrest warrants for his collapsed crypto scheme. Vanessa was conspicuously absent. My mother quietly mentioned that my sister was resting upstairs, unable to face the stress of the evening. I knew the truth was that Vanessa was hiding in her childhood bedroom, mourning the sudden death of her frozen bank accounts and her shattered socialite status. The meal began with a parade of forced pleasantries that made my skin crawl. Vernon praised the quality of the wine and asked superficial questions about the Atlanta traffic, avoiding any mention of the country club or Harrison's firing. Brenda kept pushing expensive catered food onto my plate, using a soft maternal tone she had never once used on me during my entire childhood. She talked endlessly about how much she missed our family being whole and how the house felt so empty without all her children under one roof. She looked down at her porcelain plate and dabbed her dry eyes with a linen napkin, whispering that all this terrible fighting was tearing her fragile heart apart. Vernon eventually cleared his throat and leaned forward, resting his heavy elbows on the polished wood table. He forced his face into an expression of deep paternal pride. He told me that he was genuinely astounded by my business acumen. He actually forced the words out of his mouth, claiming he had always known I had a brilliant strategic mind hidden beneath my quiet and plain exterior. It was a masterful performance of fake humility from a man who had built his life on crushing others. He then took a slow sip of his wine and gently suggested that since I was doing so incredibly well in the private equity sector, it was only right that I step up and fulfill my familial duty. He asked me to help my brother Isaiah through his temporary rough patch. Vernon framed it as a simple, quiet transfer of funds, just a few $1 million to keep the family legacy intact and protect Isaiah's brilliant tech startup from temporary liquidity issues. I set down my silver fork and looked directly at the three of them sitting across from me. I kept my voice completely level and devoid of any emotion as I told them absolutely not. I stated clearly that I would not fund Isaiah's criminal enterprises or pay a single cent to maintain their lavish, deceptive lifestyle. The supportive, loving masks they had been wearing vanished in a fraction of a second. Brenda's face hardened into a mask of pure ice, her eyes narrowing with familiar hatred. She looked at me with absolute disdain and coldly stated that this is exactly what happens when I forget my place in the family hierarchy. Her voice was sharp and venomous as she told me I was always supposed to be the quiet background character supporting the golden children who actually mattered. She sneered, saying my temporary financial luck did not change the fundamental fact that I was still the family disappointment. She told me I owed them my wealth and my absolute obedience for simply allowing me to carry their last name and live under their roof when I was an ugly, useless child. Before I could respond to her venom, Isaiah let out a dark, menacing laugh. He pushed his chair back slightly and pulled a thick black leather folder from beneath his seat. He tossed it aggressively onto the center of the dining table, sending a crystal water glass tipping over. The ice water spilled across the expensive mahogany wood, but nobody moved to wipe it up. Isaiah leaned back and crossed his arms, looking at me with a predatory glint in his eyes. He told me he knew I would be stubborn and ungrateful, so he had prepared a necessary contingency plan. He instructed me to open the folder and look at the future he had designed for me. I slowly reached out and flipped open the heavy leather cover. Inside were dozens of printed digital photographs and pages of highly detailed email transcripts. I scanned the documents and felt a brief flicker of genuine surprise at the level of detail. The photos had been masterfully doctored using advanced technology to show me sitting in secret meetings with known corporate spies and disgraced hedge fund managers. The emails were completely fabricated exchanges between my private equity firm and illegal offshore accounts discussing massive illegal insider trading schemes. It was a complete fabrication, but the digital rendering and the technical jargon were incredibly convincing. To an untrained federal investigator, it would look like hard, undeniable evidence of a massive financial conspiracy. Isaiah leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a dangerous, threatening whisper. He explained that before his tech startup went under, his engineers had developed some very advanced deep fake software. He told me that these printed documents were just copies, and the digital source files were sitting on a secure server ready to be emailed directly to the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission with a single keystroke. He smiled a cruel, twisted smile and stated that the SEC would freeze my firm immediately pending a massive federal probe. He promised that my pristine professional reputation would be destroyed overnight, and I would spend the next 20 years rotting in a federal penitentiary for corporate espionage and insider trading. Isaiah told me there was only one way to stop him from sending the files to the authorities. He demanded that I sign over complete legal ownership of my private equity firm directly to him. He wanted all my assets, my entire corporate portfolio, and everything I had built transferred into his name by midnight. He told me I was going to walk away with nothing, and he was going to take his rightful place as the billionaire head of the family. My parents sat in silence, watching me intently. Vernon nodded slowly, approving of his son's ruthless criminal blackmail. Brenda sipped her wine, looking completely unbothered by the fact that her son was threatening to send her daughter to federal prison. They sat there waiting for me to break under the pressure. They expected me to beg for mercy. They expected me to cry and plead for my freedom just like I used to beg for their love and approval when I was a terrified teenager. They thought they had finally found the weapon that would force me back to my knees. I did not beg. I did not cry. I did not even blink at my brother's pathetic attempt at extortion. I slowly closed the leather folder and pushed it back across the wet table. I casually pulled my phone out of my dress pocket and tapped the screen. I swiped up to access the mansion's smart home network. It was an integrated digital audio and visual system I had personally wired and installed for Vernon years ago, when he demanded I make myself useful around the house instead of reading my books. They had never bothered to change the administrative passwords because they never believed I was smart enough to use their own house against them. I connected my phone directly to the massive 70-inch smart TV mounted on the dining room wall, right above the antique fireplace. The large screen flickered to life, casting a bright blue digital glow over my family's shocked and confused faces. I pressed play on a highly classified digital audio file I had retrieved from their supposedly secure company servers earlier that week. The crystal-clear recording filled the silent dining room, echoing off the high ceiling. It was Vernon and Isaiah's voices, completely unfiltered and undeniable. The audio captured a secret late-night meeting in Vernon's corporate office. They were actively and explicitly planning a massive illegal tax evasion scheme. I watched my father's face turn the color of ash as his own voice blasted through the speakers, detailing exactly how they were going to hide the remaining family assets from the IRS. The recording captured Isaiah explaining the technical process of routing millions of dollars through dummy corporations and shell companies in Panama to avoid federal taxation. It was hard, irrefutable evidence of a massive federal conspiracy to defraud the United States government. I let the audio play for a full minute, ensuring they heard every damning detail of their own criminal enterprise. Then I casually tapped my phone screen and paused the audio. The sudden silence in the dining room was heavy and suffocating. I looked across the table at my brother and my parents, who were now staring at the blank television screen in absolute terror. They had tried to bury me with fake evidence, but I had just handed them their own real destruction. The crushing silence in the dining room lasted for what felt like an eternity before the sheer terror on Vernon's face morphed into something entirely different. The pale shock of being caught, red-handed, vanished, and his skin flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. The mask of the sophisticated, wealthy patriarch melted away completely, leaving behind a cornered and violent man. He let out a guttural sound that was half scream and half growl. He kicked his heavy mahogany dining chair backward with such force that it crashed to the floor, splintering against the marble tile. Vernon charged across the room with terrifying speed for a man his age. He bypassed the table completely and positioned his massive frame directly in front of the heavy double doors that led out to the foyer. He crossed his thick arms over his chest, physically trapping me inside the dining room. His eyes were wild and bloodshot as he glared down at me. He stood there, panting heavily, towering over me, and trying to use his sheer physical size to intimidate me into submission, just as he had done when I was a helpless child. He pointed a trembling, meaty finger directly at my face and demanded that I hand over my phone immediately. His voice vibrated with a raw, terrifying rage as he commanded me to unlock the device and surrender every single access code to my private equity firm. He demanded the routing numbers, the server passwords, and the administrative rights to my entire corporate portfolio. He screamed that I had no right to hold his future hostage and that I was going to transfer every dime of my wealth into his personal accounts before I ever walked out of that room. I stayed perfectly still, sitting in my chair and looking up at the man who was supposed to protect me from the evils of the world. I did not hand him the phone. I just watched his desperation consume him. Vernon began to rant, pacing back and forth in front of the locked doors. He shouted about how he had built his logistics empire from absolute dirt. He reminded the room that he had started with one broken-down delivery truck and worked his fingers to the bone to create a $50 million legacy. He roared that he had sacrificed his youth, his sweat, and his blood to build a dynasty that commanded respect in Atlanta society. He looked at me with profound disgust and stated that he would absolutely not let an ungrateful, plain-looking girl tear down his life work out of petty spite. He leaned forward, placing his hands heavily on the dining table and bringing his face dangerously close to mine. He told me that my aesthetic had always been an insult to the brand he was trying to build. He said I was the ugly duckling who refused to play the game, while Vanessa and Isaiah were the true stars destined for greatness. He declared that as the head of the household, he was the rightful owner of all assets generated by anyone with his last name. He claimed my financial success was nothing more than a fluke, and that my money belonged to him, to distribute to the deserving children who actually understood the weight of the family legacy. He pointed to Isaiah, who was still sweating profusely, but starting to regain his arrogant smirk now that our father was using physical intimidation. Vernon loudly proclaimed that Isaiah was a visionary who just needed a little capital to change the world, and Vanessa was a society queen who deserved the luxury she was born into. He told me I was a minor glitch in his system and he was going to correct that glitch tonight. Sensing that the power dynamic in the room was shifting toward violence, Harrison saw an opportunity to win back my father's favor. Harrison had been sitting in terrified silence since I destroyed his career, but now he aggressively stepped forward, pulling at the cuffs of his expensive shirt. His face was twisted in a desperate sneer as he moved around the table to stand directly behind my chair. He wanted to show Vernon that he was still a real man who knew how to handle business. Harrison cracked his knuckles loudly, intentionally making a threatening sound right next to my ear. He told Vernon that trying to reason with me was a waste of time. He stated that I was clearly delusional and needed to be handled with force. Harrison leaned down, his breath hot against my neck, and threatened to physically restrain me. He told my father they could just tie my arms to the heavy wooden dining chair and force my thumb onto the phone's biometric scanner to unlock the accounts. He detailed exactly how easy it would be to physically overpower me, hold me down, and manually execute the wire transfers themselves while I watched helplessly. I looked over at my mother, Brenda, expecting her to finally draw a line, expecting her to stop two grown men from threatening to assault her daughter over money. Instead, Brenda sat perfectly still at the table, smoothing the fabric of her silk napkin. She looked at me with cold, dead eyes and simply nodded her approval. She softly stated that this is what happens when people forget their place in the family hierarchy. She told me I had brought this violence upon myself by daring to challenge my betters. Isaiah chimed in, laughing nervously and pulling out his own laptop, ready to initiate the hostile transfer of my funds as soon as Harrison pinned me down. They had completely abandoned any pretense of civilization. They were nothing but greedy, desperate criminals willing to physically assault their own blood just to maintain their fake luxury lifestyle. They waited for my reaction. They waited for the tears to fall, for the panic to set in, for me to drop the phone and beg for their mercy. They wanted me to apologize for exposing their crimes and gladly hand over my billion-dollar empire just to avoid being hurt. They thought the threat of physical pain would shatter the cold, clinical clarity I had maintained all evening. I did not beg. I did not scream for help. I did not even bother to stand up from my chair. I simply looked at Harrison looming over my shoulder and then at Vernon blocking the door. I reached up with my left hand and pushed my sleeve back slightly, revealing the sleek digital smartwatch strapped to my wrist. I did not say a single word as I tapped a glowing red icon on the small screen. Vernon let out a sharp bark of laughter, asking if I really thought calling the local police would save me. He bragged that he golfed with the chief of police and that no local cop would dare arrest him inside his own mansion. He told me I was completely out of options. He was still talking when the heavy oak front doors of the mansion were violently kicked open. The massive crashing sound echoed like a gunshot through the grand foyer, shaking the very foundations of the house. Vernon stopped mid-sentence, his eyes darting toward the hallway. Harrison froze, his hands hovering inches from my shoulders. Brenda let out a startled shriek and dropped her wineglass, shattering it against the floor. The sound of dozens of heavy tactical boots storming across the marble floors of the entryway completely drowned out the soft classical music that had been playing through the house speakers. Loud, commanding voices echoed through the corridors, barking tactical orders and securing the perimeter. My family stood frozen in absolute shock as the dining room doors were shoved open so forcefully they slammed against the interior walls. A highly coordinated team of federal agents poured into the room. They were wearing dark tactical gear with the bold yellow letters IRS emblazoned across their tactical vests. They moved with lethal efficiency, instantly fanning out to secure every exit and surround the dining table. Vernon stumbled backward away from the doors, his hands raised instinctively in the air. Harrison scrambled backward away from my chair, looking as if he was about to pass out from sheer terror. The tactical agents parted down the middle, creating a clear path. Walking calmly through the center of the armed federal squad was Evelyn Dubois. She looked absolutely magnificent in a sharp, tailored black suit, holding a massive stack of thick legal documents stamped with official federal seals. She exuded an aura of absolute, unchecked authority. Vernon stared at her, his jaw trembling as he recognized the woman from the country club. He frantically tried to use his rich businessman persona, demanding to know what the meaning of this intrusion was. He yelled that they had the wrong house and that he was a respected pillar of the Atlanta business community. He ordered the agents to leave his property immediately before he sued their entire department for harassment. Evelyn did not even blink at his blustering. She walked right up to Vernon and shoved the heavy stack of federal warrants directly into his chest, forcing him to take them. She looked him dead in the eye and spoke with a voice that carried no warmth and no mercy. She told Vernon they were not there by mistake. She announced clearly so the entire room could hear that she was the lead forensic investigator for the Federal Internal Revenue Service Criminal Division. She informed Vernon that the audio recording I had just played in the dining room had been transmitted directly to her federal servers hours ago. She stated that based on the explicit evidence of massive tax evasion, offshore money laundering, and corporate fraud, they had secured immediate emergency warrants from a federal judge. Vernon dropped the papers, his hands shaking violently as the reality of his doom finally took hold. Brenda began to wail loudly, collapsing onto the dining table. Isaiah frantically tried to slam his laptop shut, but an agent immediately grabbed his arm and confiscated the device as hard evidence of the crypto Ponzi scheme. Harrison was backing slowly into a corner, mumbling incoherently to himself. Evelyn looked around the room at the pathetic, crumbling remains of my family. She announced that the federal government was officially seizing the mansion, the corporate logistics empire, all domestic and international bank accounts, and every single luxury vehicle parked in the driveway. She told Vernon that his estate was now federal property and that he had exactly 10 minutes to gather a single bag of basic clothing before he was escorted off the premises in handcuffs. I slowly stood up from my chair, smoothing the fabric of my simple black dress. I walked past Harrison, who was shaking uncontrollably. I walked past Isaiah, who was currently being read his Miranda rights by a very large tactical agent. I stopped right in front of Vernon, who was staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. His entire legacy, his wealth, his status, and his false pride had just been completely incinerated. I looked at the man who had called me ugly and worthless my entire life, and I gave him a soft, genuine smile. I told him he was right about one thing. I told him I really did not belong in his world anymore because his world no longer existed. I turned my back on my family and walked out of the mansion alongside Evelyn, stepping out into the cool, clean night air while the federal agents tore their empire apart piece by piece. The chaotic symphony of absolute betrayal pulled me back into the dining room just as I had reached the heavy oak doors of the grand foyer. I turned around and stood quietly by the arched entryway, watching the fortress of family loyalty completely disintegrate under the crushing weight of federal authority. There was no honor among thieves, and there was certainly no loyalty in a family built entirely on lies. The moment Evelyn Dubois and her tactical team began confiscating laptops and bagging physical documents, the carefully constructed facade of the empire vanished. It was total and complete chaos. The unified front they had just weaponized against me only moments before evaporated instantly as basic survival instincts kicked in. Harrison was the first to crack. The smooth, confident corporate lawyer who had just threatened to physically assault me was now trembling like a frightened child. He watched two armed agents walk toward him with handcuffs, and his self-preservation completely overrode his loyalty to the family that had elevated him. He threw his hands up in the air, backing away from the agents and pointing a trembling finger directly at my father. His voice was shrill and panicked as he loudly declared his innocence to anyone who would listen. He threw Vernon under the bus without a single second of hesitation. Harrison screamed that he was just taking orders. He frantically babbled that the embezzlement and the offshore accounts were all Vernon's idea. He claimed he had physical documentation hidden in a secure vault, proving that Vernon had forced him to manipulate the firm ledgers to hide assets from domestic regulators. He told the federal agents that Vernon was a tyrannical monster who threatened to ruin his career if he did not comply with the illegal transfers. The white knight of the family the man Vernon had just praised as a real businessman was practically weeping as he begged the agents for immunity in exchange for his full cooperation against his father-in-law. Vernon let out a sound like a wounded animal. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple as he lunged toward Harrison, his massive hands curled into tight fists. Federal agents immediately stepped between them, shoving my father back against the dining table. Vernon completely lost his mind, roaring at Harrison and calling him a weak, cowardly parasite. The patriarch, who demanded absolute submission from everyone around him, was forced to stand helplessly, while the very man he had chosen to protect his legacy sold him out to stay out of federal prison. Vernon yelled that Harrison was a pathetic failure who had dragged the family name through the mud, but his protests sounded hollow and desperate over the noise of the raiding agents. Vanessa did not rush to her husband's defense. My sister, who had spent the entire afternoon at the country club clinging to Harrison's arm and bragging about his massive wealth, now looked at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. The silver sequined gown she wore seemed to mock the dirty reality of her collapsing marriage. Vanessa stepped forward and screamed at Harrison, her voice echoing harshly off the marble walls. She demanded a divorce right then and there. She was completely panicked about her own social standing in the Atlanta elite circles. She realized that being married to a disgraced, broke federal criminal would instantly exile her from the high society life she worshipped. She shrieked that she knew absolutely nothing about the stolen money or the offshore accounts. She tried to physically distance herself from Harrison, yelling to the federal agents that she was a victim of his deception just like everyone else. She pulled the massive diamond engagement ring off her finger and threw it aggressively onto the wet mahogany dining table. It bounced off a crystal water glass and landed near the spilled ice. She told Harrison he disgusted her and that she would not let a pathetic criminal drag her down into the dirt. Her performance was purely transactional. She was shedding her husband the exact same way a snake sheds its skin, trying to save her own perfect image, while her world burned to the ground around her. While Vanessa and Harrison were screaming at each other, and Vernon was fighting against the federal agents, I noticed a quiet movement near the back of the room. Isaiah was slowly and carefully inching his way toward the heavy glass doors that led out to the back patio. My brilliant Ivy League brother truly believed that his family members' loud, chaotic arguments would provide enough cover for him to execute a stealthy escape. He was sweating profusely, his designer shirt clinging to his back as he reached out a trembling hand toward the brass handle of the patio door. He thought he could just slip away into the Georgia night and leave his parents to take the fall for everything. He did not even get the door halfway open. A massive tactical agent stepped out of the shadows on the patio and shoved the door hard, driving Isaiah backward into the dining room. Another agent immediately grabbed him by the shoulder and spun him around. Isaiah let out a pathetic yelp, his knees buckling under him. He started stammering uncontrollably, telling the agents that they were making a huge mistake. He practically cried as he recited his Ivy League pedigree, begging them to understand that he was just a visionary tech founder who had gotten mixed up with the wrong venture capitalists. He tried to claim that the crypto Ponzi scheme was just a coding error and that he never intended to defraud anyone. The agent simply ignored his desperate whining, pulling his arms behind his back and snapping cold metal handcuffs around his wrists. The golden boy was completely paralyzed by fear, his arrogant superiority replaced by the terrifying reality of a concrete cell. The room was a symphony of destruction, and I just stood silently by the archway watching them all reap exactly what they had sown. Then my mother Brenda turned and looked at me. She had been standing frozen near the head of the table watching her husband, her golden son, and her perfect son-in-law collapse into complete ruin. She saw me standing there, my face composed and my posture relaxed. She saw Evelyn Dubois standing respectfully a few feet behind me, holding the heavy stacks of federal warrants. Brenda finally calculated the true power dynamic in the room. She finally realized that the ugly, useless daughter she had spent decades emotionally abusing was the only person on earth who had the power to stop this nightmare. Brenda completely abandoned her pristine, dignified matriarch persona. She dropped her limited edition designer handbag, letting it hit the wet marble floor. She took a few stumbling steps toward me, and then her legs gave out. My mother fell to her knees right there in the grand dining room. She began to sob openly, tears streaming down her face and ruining her expensive makeup. She crawled forward on her knees until she was just a few feet away from me. She reached out her trembling hands, grasping frantically at the fabric of my simple black dress. Her voice was a desperate broken wail as she looked up at me. She started calling me her beautiful, brilliant baby girl. She sobbed that she had always known I was the smartest and most capable child in the family. She frantically tried to rewrite 30 years of psychological torture by claiming that her harsh treatment and endless criticism was just tough love designed to make me strong enough for the corporate world. She begged me to forgive her for being so blind. She pleaded with me to use my massive wealth and my obvious federal connections to call off the agents. She cried that they were my family, my own blood, and that I could not possibly let them take her husband and her son away in chains. She looked up at me with pathetic, desperate eyes, begging for the mercy she had never once shown me. I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. This was the mother who had stood by while men threatened to assault me. The mother who had guilt-tripped me over childhood medical bills just days prior. The mother who had called me a parasite and a disappointment simply because I refused to conform to her toxic, shallow worldview. I looked at her tear-streaked face, and I felt absolutely nothing. The well of empathy I used to reserve for my family had run completely dry. There was no anger left in me, no sadness, and no desire for revenge. There was only cold, clinical clarity. I gently stepped back, pulling the fabric of my dress from her desperate grasp. I did not bend down to help her up. I looked over at Evelyn, who stepped forward silently and handed me a thick, heavy physical file. I walked over to the dining table, stepping carefully around the shattered pieces of Vernon's chair. I slid the thick file onto the polished mahogany wood right next to Vanessa's discarded wedding ring. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the table momentarily silenced the screaming and arguing in the room. Vernon, Harrison, and Vanessa all turned to look at the file. I turned back to look down at my mother, who was still kneeling on the cold floor. I kept my voice completely level, soft, and devoid of any emotional attachment. I told her that she was severely underestimating the scope of the investigation. I looked at my parents and my siblings and delivered the final crushing truth. I told them coldly that I did not call the Internal Revenue Service for simple tax evasion. I told them I called the federal authorities for massive wire fraud and international money laundering. The tax evasion was just the warm-up. The heavy file on the table contained every single deleted email, every hidden offshore routing number, and every piece of doctored evidence Isaiah had ever created. Their entire lives were officially over, and there was absolutely no one left to save them. The heavy silence in the dining room was broken only by the sound of Vernon's erratic breathing as he stared at the blank television screen. I reached into my leather tote bag, resting at my feet, and pulled out a thick physical file. I tossed it onto the center of the mahogany table, right on top of Isaiah's pathetic forged documents. The heavy thud made Brenda jump in her seat. I looked down at my mother, completely devoid of emotion. I told her I did not call the IRS for simple tax evasion. I spoke coldly and clearly, stating that I called them for massive wire fraud and international money laundering. I leaned forward and flipped open the heavy manila folder. I began the final, methodical dismantling of their fake lives. I looked directly at Harrison, who was currently gripping the edge of the table with white knuckles. I pulled out the first stack of highlighted bank statements and slid them toward him. I explained that his prestigious law career was nothing but a hollow front. The documents proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that he had been actively laundering millions of dollars for a ruthless offshore syndicate. I detailed how he had used the firm accounts to cover his own massive underground gambling debts. His face drained of all color, taking on a sickly gray hue, as I read off the exact routing numbers and the specific dates of his illegal transfers. He tried to speak, but his throat was completely dry. His entire corporate identity was evaporating right in front of his eyes. I then turned my gaze to my brilliant brother Isaiah, who was now physically shaking in his expensive tailored shirt. I reached into the folder and pulled out the corporate registry documents for his highly praised Silicon Valley tech startup. I walked them through the undeniable paper trail proving that his entire company was a complete sham. It was nothing more than a digital shell company specifically designed to wash Harrison's dirty syndicate money and funnel it back into the domestic economy. I told Isaiah there was no revolutionary software and there were no legitimate investors. It was just a massive illegal washing machine for criminal funds. The arrogant tech founder persona he loved to flaunt vanished instantly, leaving behind a terrified little boy staring at decades in a federal penitentiary. Vernon finally found his voice and tried to defend his empire, but I immediately cut him off. I slid the final massive stack of financial papers toward him. It was a complete and unedited copy of his private corporate ledgers. The pages featured his own authorized physical signatures on every single fraudulent transfer. I told him that ignorance was no longer a viable legal defense. The documents prove that he had knowingly and willingly signed off on the fake ledgers. He had actively facilitated a massive federal crime simply because he was too terrified of losing his precious country club status and his fragile image as a wealthy, untouchable patriarch. He had mortgaged his own soul and the freedom of his family just to keep up appearances and stroke his massive ego. Vernon slumped back into his heavy mahogany chair, gasping for air, as his entire legacy turned to dust. The loud commotion and the undeniable sound of my voice had drawn Vanessa out of hiding. My sister stood trembling in the arched doorway wearing her designer silk pajamas. She had been listening to the absolute deconstruction of her perfect artificial life. I looked at Vanessa and let the cold, devastating reality wash over her. I explained that every single designer dress in her massive closet was bought with stolen money. I told her the luxury cars sitting in their wide circular driveway and the exclusive country club memberships they bragged about were all funded by criminal enterprises. "You spent your entire life calling me the ugly one," I said, staring directly into her terrified, tear-filled eyes. I told her she thought her wealth made her beautiful, but they were the ones rotting from the inside out. I stated that her entire existence was nothing but a criminal lie built on the backs of innocent people. Suddenly, the heavy oak front doors of the mansion were violently kicked open. The massive crashing sound echoed like a thunderclap through the grand foyer, shaking the very foundation of the house. A highly coordinated team of armed federal agents wearing dark tactical gear swarmed into the dining room. They moved with lethal military efficiency, securing every exit and completely surrounding the dining table. The sheer force of their presence sucked all the remaining air out of the room. Brenda fell to her knees, weeping uncontrollably. Vernon put his head in his hands. Harrison immediately panicked and tried to rely on the only thing that had ever saved him before. He desperately tried to assert his arrogant white privilege. He puffed out his chest, trying to look imposing, and stepped aggressively toward the lead federal agent. Harrison began yelling at the top of his lungs, declaring that this raid was all a massive mistake and a gross violation of his civil rights. He demanded that the armed agents stand down immediately and exit the premises. He screamed that he was a senior partner at a top-tier law firm, and he aggressively demanded to speak to their direct superior right this very second. He thought his loud voice and his expensive suit would somehow intimidate a federal task force. The tall lead agent did not even blink at his pathetic blustering. The agent simply looked at Harrison with an expression of pure, unfiltered pity. The agent calmly stated that Harrison was already speaking to her. The lead federal agent then raised his gloved hand and pointed directly at me. Harrison's face slackened as his eyes followed the lead federal agent's pointing gloved finger directly at me. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish trying to find air. The absolute realization that the plain, quiet sister-in-law he had spent years mocking and dismissing was the actual architect of his destruction finally penetrated his thick, arrogant skull. His white privilege, and his expensive law degree meant absolutely nothing in the face of a billionaire with undeniable federal evidence. The agents did not give him time to process his shattered ego. Two burly tactical agents stepped forward and grabbed Harrison's arms, twisting them sharply and violently behind his back. The crisp, metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly through the ruined dining room. Harrison instantly collapsed into a pathetic, sobbing mess. The high-powered corporate attorney who had just threatened to physically assault me and strap me to a chair was now weeping uncontrollably. Tears and snot streamed down his face as his knees buckled, forcing the two large agents to physically hold him upright just to keep him from collapsing into a puddle on the floor. He began begging the agents for a deal, pleading with them to understand he was a victim. He turned his desperate, tear-streaked face toward me and begged me to tell them it was all a terrible joke. He even screamed for Vanessa to call his defense team, but she just stared at him with absolute horrified disgust, backing away, as if he were carrying a deadly disease. The agents read him his Miranda rights in a flat, clinical, monotone voice, completely ignoring his cowardly whimpering as they dragged him out the front doors and down the stone steps toward the waiting federal transport vans. Isaiah watched Harrison get hauled away, and absolute primal panic seized him. The smug, untouchable Silicon Valley tech bro facade completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified child. He started thrashing violently against the agent who was holding his arms, screaming at the top of his lungs that he was a certified genius and that he did not belong in a cage. He yelled that his mind was too valuable for prison, that he was on the verge of changing the digital world, and that they were making a catastrophic mistake by arresting him. The agent simply tightened his grip and yanked Isaiah forward with a rough physical jerk. My brother dug his expensive Italian leather loafers into the marble floor, desperately trying to resist the momentum, but he was absolutely no match for the trained tactical team. Isaiah shrieked for our father to do something, to call his influential senators to bribe the right politicians to make this nightmare disappear. He screamed my name, calling me a monster, a jealous failure and a traitor to our own bloodline. His voice cracked into a high-pitched hysterical wail as they hauled him across the grand foyer. His desperate screams bounced off the high vaulted ceilings of the mansion, echoing through the empty halls until the heavy oak front doors shut behind him, completely silencing his pathetic tantrum. Vanessa had backed herself into the far corner of the dining room, pressing her spine against the expensive silk wallpaper. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she watched her husband and her brother get dragged out of the house like common street thugs. A female federal agent approached her holding a clear plastic evidence bag. The agent looked Vanessa up and down, clinically taking inventory of her lavish accessories. The agent calmly instructed Vanessa to hand over her diamond earrings, her platinum tennis bracelet, and the massive emerald pendant resting against her collarbone. Vanessa gasped, clutching her chest and demanding to know why they were robbing her in her own home. She shrieked that she had rights and that her jewelry was private property. Evelyn Dubois stepped over and coldly informed my sister that every single piece of jewelry she was currently wearing had been purchased with illicit funds routed directly through Harrison's illegal offshore syndicate accounts. It was not her private property. It was criminal evidence, subject to immediate federal seizure. Vanessa began to shake violently, her breath hitching in her throat as a massive panic attack fully took hold. She sobbed hysterically as the female agent firmly ordered her to take off the diamonds immediately. Vanessa's manicured hands trembled so badly she could barely undo the intricate clasps of her necklaces and bracelets. The agent eventually had to step in and physically remove the diamond rings right off Vanessa's fingers, dropping them into the plastic evidence bag where they landed with a dull, pathetic clatter. The high society queen who had built her entire identity on showing off her stolen wealth and putting others down was stripped of her armor right in front of my eyes. They left her standing there barefoot in her silk pajamas, looking completely hollow, utterly ordinary, and entirely broken. Vernon had been standing near the head of the ruined table, watching his carefully curated dynasty being violently disassembled piece by piece. The man who had ruled our family and his company, with an iron fist of financial intimidation, was now completely powerless to stop his own downfall. The sheer magnitude of his loss, the absolute and total destruction of his legacy, his untouchable reputation, and his imminent freedom suddenly hit him like a physical blow. His face turned a terrifying ashen shade of gray. He let out a choked, gasping sound, clutching at his throat. His knees suddenly buckled beneath his massive weight. Vernon grabbed his chest, his heavy hands gripping and tearing at the fabric of his custom-tailored shirt as he collapsed onto the wet mahogany dining table and then slid heavily down onto the cold marble floor. Brenda screamed his name, rushing to his side in a panic, but the federal agents were already moving. Evelyn dubbed her radio, instantly calling for the emergency medical team that had been stationed outside on the perimeter, specifically for this kind of scenario. Within seconds, federal paramedics rushed into the dining room carrying heavy green emergency medical bags. They knelt beside my father, quickly checking his erratic vitals and securing a clear oxygen mask over his pale face. The lead paramedic announced to the room that Vernon was experiencing a mild stress-induced heart attack brought on by the sudden extreme shock of the raid. They quickly and efficiently loaded his heavy frame onto a collapsible medical stretcher. As they prepared to wheel him out of the room, Evelyn dubbed, leaned down over the stretcher, resting her hands on the metal rails. Vernon's eyes were wide open, filled with a terrified, helpless panic as he looked up at the federal investigator. Evelyn did not offer a single ounce of comfort or sympathy. She looked down at the ruined patriarch and informed him in a voice as cold and hard as ice that the paramedics were taking him to the local hospital under armed federal guard. She told him to enjoy the soft hospital bed and the warm meals, because the very second the doctors discharged him and cleared him for travel, he was going straight to a federal penitentiary where he would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. Vernon let out a muffled, agonizing groan into his plastic oxygen mask as they wheeled him out of the dining room, leaving a trail of chaos in his wake. The violent storm of activity slowly began to settle, leaving a haunting, heavy silence in its wake. The tactical agents had cleared the room, leaving only Evelyn, a few evidence technicians bagging the files, and my mother. Brenda stood completely alone in the center of the massive, empty dining room. The vintage family china was knocked over and broken, the crystal wine glasses were shattered across the floor, and the physical evidence of their massive crimes was stacked neatly on the table, waiting to be sealed in boxes. Brenda's perfect salon hair was severely disheveled, and her expensive cashmere clothes looked wrinkled and pathetic. She slowly turned her head and looked directly at me. For the first time in my entire 32 years of life, the thick, suffocating fog of arrogance and narcissism had lifted completely from her eyes. She looked around the seized mansion, realizing the sheer totality of what had just occurred. Her wealthy, powerful husband was on his way to prison. Her golden, visionary son was locked in handcuffs. Her perfect, wealthy son-in-law was a sobbing, exposed criminal, and her beautiful socialite daughter was stripped of her stolen jewels and her dignity. She looked at me standing there with my shoulders relaxed and my head held high, completely untouched by the absolute destruction around me. Brenda finally realized that the plain, quiet daughter she had systematically thrown away, dismissed, bullied, and treated like absolute garbage, was the only person in the room who actually possessed true power and undeniable integrity. She realized that if she had just loved me, if she had just treated me with a single ounce of basic human decency over the decades, she would be safely standing beside a billionaire daughter right now, shielded from the storm. Instead, she had actively chosen the fake illusion of wealth and status over her own flesh and blood, and that choice had just cost her absolutely everything she held dear. Her pale lips trembled as she tried to speak, trying desperately to find the right words to bridge the massive canyon she had spent a lifetime digging between us. She opened her mouth to beg to apologize, to negotiate a surrender, but no words came out. There was nothing left to say. The silence between us was the loudest sound in the world. I did not feel the need to gloat or rub her face in the dirt. I did not need to scream or cry or demand a tearful apology that I knew would be entirely fake anyway. The absolute methodical destruction of their fake empire was all the closure I would ever need in this lifetime. I looked at Brenda for one final long moment, letting her look deep into my eyes and see the complete, total emptiness there. I had nothing left to give her. I turned around and calmly walked out of the dining room. My practical shoes clicked softly and rhythmically against the marble floor of the grand foyer, echoing through the massive hollow house that had always felt more like a toxic prison than a home. I walked out the heavy front doors and stepped down the wide stone steps, inhaling the crisp, cool, clean night air. My lungs felt expanding and free for the first time since I was a child. Behind me, federal agents were systematically ushering Brenda and Vanessa out of the house. They were given exactly 10 minutes to pack a single small duffel bag of basic necessities and standard clothing before they were officially evicted from the seized property. I walked down the long, winding, tree-lined driveway toward my modest, reliable sedan parked quietly near the front gate. I turned back one last time and watched as the federal agents pulled heavy, thick steel chains through the brass handles of the massive oak front doors. The sharp, echoing, metallic sound of the heavy federal padlock snapping shut rang out clearly into the quiet Georgia night. The mansion was officially locked down, secured, and entirely dark. Brenda and Vanessa stood on the curb near the street, shivering in the night air, clutching their small bags, and watching their entire perfectly curated world turn to absolute ash. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away into the night, leaving them alone in the dark to face the brutal reality they had built for themselves. Driving away that night was the first time I truly exhaled in 32 years. The rearview mirror showed nothing but the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the dark trees. But I did not look back. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of federal indictments, asset seizures, and merciless legal proceedings. The media descended like vultures, tearing apart the corpse of my father's fake empire, but I stayed completely out of the spotlight, letting the federal prosecutors do exactly what they were trained to do. 6 months passed before the dust finally settled and the new reality firmly took root. The federal justice system moves with a brutal, terrifying efficiency when the evidence is handed to them on a silver platter. Vernon Harrison and Isaiah were completely denied bail. Their expensive defense attorneys immediately abandoned them when they realized there was absolutely no clean money left to pay their massive legal retainers. They all pleaded guilty to avoid a drawn-out public trial that would have exposed even worse secrets and guaranteed them life behind bars. Vernon was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The man who used to scream at waiters for serving the wrong vintage of wine was now wearing a scratchy orange jumpsuit and eating bland tray food on a strict, unforgiving schedule. The stress of losing his entire identity was too much for his heart to take. He suffered a mild heart attack the very night of the raid, and the federal agents had happily waited outside his hospital room until the doctors cleared him for transport. He was wheeled directly from a comfortable hospital bed into the cold back of a federal transport van. His status, his wealth, and his intimidating physical size meant absolutely nothing inside those concrete walls. He was just another number rotting away in a cell. Harrison received 15 years for his central role in laundering millions for the international syndicate. The smooth-talking corporate lawyer who had threatened to tie me to a chair and force my thumb onto a biometric scanner completely broke down during his sentencing hearing. He sobbed loudly in the crowded courtroom, begging the judge for a mercy that never came. His prestigious law license was permanently revoked, and his reputation was completely incinerated. The offshore criminals he had been working for were furious that he had left a paper trail, and the federal prosecutors had to place him in protective custody just to keep him breathing. He was a terrified coward locked in a cage jumping at every single shadow. Isaiah, my supposedly brilliant brother, was handed 10 years for his massive crypto fraud. The golden boy of Silicon Valley was absolutely paralyzed by the reality of his situation. He had spent his entire life believing his Ivy League brain made him infinitely superior to everyone else, but his expensive education could not code him a way out of federal prison. He was dragged out of the courtroom, screaming and crying that it was all a mistake. He was now forced to scrub concrete floors and sleep on a thin mattress surrounded by the very criminals he thought he was so much smarter than. Their fake dynasty was officially buried under the crushing weight of the federal justice system. Brenda and Vanessa were not criminally charged, but their punishment was arguably far more poetic and devastating. Without the stolen money, the offshore accounts, or the corporate credit cards, they were instantly plunged into absolute grinding poverty. The federal government seized the mansion, the cars, the bank accounts, and every single piece of valuable jewelry Vanessa owned. They were evicted with nothing but the small duffel bags they had packed on the night of the raid. They were forced to move into a tiny, rundown two-bedroom apartment in a dangerous, neglected neighborhood miles away from the manicured lawns of their old life. The walls were stained, the plumbing constantly leaked, and the smell of old grease hung heavy in the air. Vanessa, the high society queen who once threw a massive tantrum over a scratched designer handbag, was now forced to work the early morning shift at a fast food drive-thru. She had to wear a terrible polyester uniform, and her hands were constantly burned by the deep fryer. The minimum wage she earned barely covered her half of the rent. Brenda, my mother, who used to host lavish charity galas and look down her nose at anyone wearing last season's fashion, was forced to take a job cleaning hotel rooms on the night shift. She had to scrub toilets, change dirty sheets, and vacuum floors for tourists who treated her exactly the way she used to treat the help. The physical labor broke her fragile body, and the sheer humiliation completely shattered her mind. They lived in constant misery, blaming each other for their downfall and sobbing over the ghost of a life that was always a lie. The most delicious part of their downfall was the absolute crushing silence from their former circle. The Atlanta elite, who had attended their lavish parties, drank their expensive champagne, and praised their fake success completely, turned their backs on them. Brenda had desperately tried reaching out to her old country club friends, begging for small loans or simple favors, but her calls went straight to voicemail. The women she used to play tennis with treated her like a contagious disease, crossing the street to avoid her if they ever saw her waiting for the public bus. Ironically, those exact same socialites were now desperately trying to court my favor. My private equity firm had tripled in value after the acquisition, and the media had briefly highlighted my central role in exposing the massive corporate fraud. Suddenly, the women who used to call me plain and boring were sending massive, expensive floral arrangements to my office and leaving desperate voicemails inviting me to their exclusive galas. They wanted access to my billionaire status and the untouchable power I now commanded. I never answered a single one of their calls. I simply threw their expensive embossed invitations directly into the shredder where they belonged. I had absolutely zero interest in occupying the empty, shallow world my family had destroyed themselves trying to impress. Instead, I focused my energy and my immense resources on building something that actually mattered. Exactly 6 months to the day after the federal raid, I stood on a wide, pristine sidewalk in the heart of downtown Atlanta. The bright morning sun reflected brilliantly off the sleek glass exterior of a massive state-of-the-art corporate building that I had purchased outright. A large crowd of local business owners, community leaders, and excited young women had gathered around the entrance. I was not there to launch another soulless corporate shell company or a fake tech startup. I was there to cut the thick silk ribbon on my brand new financial literacy and business incubation center. I had specifically designed and fully funded the entire initiative to help underprivileged minority women start their own businesses. I wanted to give them the capital, the legal protection, and the brutal financial education they needed, so no man could ever control them or steal their hard work. I wanted to build an army of women who knew exactly how to read a ledger, spot a fraud, and build their own empires from scratch. As I stood there holding the oversized ceremonial scissors, I looked out at the faces of the women in the crowd. They were hungry, ambitious, and brilliant. They did not care about designer labels or country club gossip. They just wanted a fair chance to build a real legacy for their children. I sliced through the thick red ribbon, and the crowd erupted into genuine loud applause. There were no fake smiles, no hidden agendas, and no toxic manipulation. It was just pure, authentic triumph. I had taken the ashes of my father's toxic empire and used the soil to plant a garden that would actually feed the community for generations to come. After the ceremony concluded, I took the private secure elevator up to the top floor of the building. The sleek metal doors glided open, revealing my massive sunlit corner office. The walls were made of floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline. The space was decorated exactly to my taste, with clean, modern lines and quiet, unpretentious elegance. There were no portraits of fake family vacations, no heavy mahogany desks, and no tacky displays of ego. It was a sanctuary of absolute power and total peace. I walked over to my wide, sleek desk and smoothed the fabric of my sharp-tailored black suit. The heavy glass door to my office opened softly, and Evelyn Dubois walked in. She had resigned from her high-pressure position at the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Division 3 months ago, and I had immediately hired her as the Chief Operations Officer of my entire corporate portfolio. We made a terrifyingly efficient team. She walked across the room looking immaculate in a dark charcoal suit and handed me a steaming cup of dark coffee. She did not say a single word as she set a brand new, thick physical file down on the center of my desk. The thick manila cover bore the logo of a massive, highly corrupt logistics corporation that had been exploiting its workers and hiding toxic assets for a decade. It was our next target. Evelyn gave me a sharp, knowing smile, and I returned it, taking a slow sip of the bitter coffee. She turned and walked out of the office, leaving me alone in the quiet, sunlit room to prepare for the next battle. I picked up the coffee and walked slowly toward the massive window, looking down at the bustling city far below me. The cars looked like tiny metal toys, and the people were just moving specks of color rushing through their daily lives. I took a deep breath, letting the rich smell of the dark roast ground me in the present moment. The glass felt cool against my fingertips as I placed my hand against the window pane. I thought about the terrified little girl who used to hide in her bedroom praying to be invisible so her father would not yell at her. I thought about the awkward, quiet teenager who let her mother and sister convince her she was utterly worthless. I thought about the woman who sat silently at that heavy mahogany dining table just 6 months ago, while her own blood relatives threatened to physically assault her and steal everything she had ever built. None of those versions of me existed anymore. They had all been entirely burned away in the fire of that raid. I looked at my reflection in the polished glass of the window. I was no longer the quiet sister, the ugly duckling, or the convenient family scapegoat. I was the architect of my own destiny. I had torn down a kingdom of lies and built an empire of truth in its place. I was respected by the people who actually mattered, feared by the corporate criminals who deserved it, and for the first time in my entire 32 years of life, I was completely, utterly, and entirely free. The ultimate lesson from this story is that your true worth is never defined by a toxic family that only values you for how well you fit into their artificial, superficial image. When you stop seeking validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding and belittling you, you free yourself to build an authentic and powerful life. True success does not come from stolen wealth, deceit, or maintaining a fake status, but from absolute integrity, resilience, and the courage to walk away from abusive environments. By standing in your truth, you can create your own legacy and achieve ultimate freedom. If you have ever had to cut ties with toxic relatives to protect your peace, share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering journeys of survival and success.